My grandfather's family tradition involved hazing boys at 12. My brother ended up hospitalized. They called it just part of being a man. The first time I witnessed my family's twisted version of a coming-of-age ceremony, I was 10 years old and my cousin Marcus was 12. It was Labor Day weekend in 2019, and our extended family had gathered at my grandfather's remote cabin in the mountains of North Carolina for what the adults called a special weekend that would mark Marcus's transition from boyhood to manhood. Today, Marcus becomes a real member of this family, my grandfather announced to the assembled men and boys who'd gathered in the clearing behind his cabin. Today, he proves he has what it takes to carry the Sullivan name with pride. I didn't understand what was about to happen, but I could see the fear in Marcus's eyes as the adult men formed a circle around him. My father, my uncles, and several family friends who'd been invited to witness this tradition all wore expressions of grim determination, as if they were about to perform a sacred duty rather than participate in something that would traumatize a child. The Sullivan men have been tested for 4 generations, grandfather continued, his voice carrying the authority he'd wielded over our family for as long as I could remember. Every boy who wants to call himself a Sullivan has to prove he can handle pain, fear, and pressure without breaking down like a baby. What followed was 3 hours of systematic physical and psychological abuse that the adults called hazing, but which looked to my 10-year-old eyes like torture designed to terrorize a child. Marcus was blindfolded, forced to crawl through mud and thorns, made to hold uncomfortable positions until his muscles gave out, and subjected to verbal intimidation that left him crying and begging for the ordeal to end. "Stop crying," my father barked when Marcus finally broke down after being forced to carry heavy logs until his arms shook with exhaustion. "Sullivan men don't cry. If you can't handle this, you don't deserve to be part of this family." "Please, I want to stop," Marcus sobbed, his clothes torn and his arms scratched from the thorns he'd been forced to crawl through. "I'll be good, I promise. Just let me stop." "You stop when we say you stop," grandfather replied coldly. "This is what it takes to build character and toughness. Your father went through this, your uncles went through this, and every real man in this family has proven himself the same way." The tradition continued with increasingly cruel challenges designed to push Marcus beyond his physical and emotional limits. He was forced to eat disgusting combinations of food, hold his breath underwater until he nearly passed out, and endure physical pain that left bruises and cuts across his small body. "This is how we make boys into men," Uncle Ray explained to me when he noticed my distressed expression. "It's tough love that teaches important lessons about strength, endurance, and resilience. Someday you'll understand when it's your turn." But I didn't want to understand, and the thought of my turn filled me with dread that would haunt me for the next 2 years. Watching Marcus suffer while the adults I trusted and loved inflicted deliberate cruelty on him shattered something fundamental in my understanding of family, love, and protection. When the ordeal finally ended, Marcus was exhausted, traumatized, and covered in dirt and blood from the various challenges he'd endured. The men clapped him on the back and congratulated him on becoming a real Sullivan, but he looked more broken than transformed by the experience. "You did good, son," grandfather told him, placing a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You took everything we gave you and didn't quit. That's the mark of a man." "Thank you, grandfather," Marcus whispered, though his voice was hollow and defeated rather than proud or grateful. That night, Marcus cried himself to sleep in the cabin's bunk room, and I lay awake listening to his quiet sobs and wondering how the adults I loved could justify causing such pain to someone they claimed to care about. The images of his ordeal replayed in my mind for weeks afterward, and I began dreading my own 12th birthday with a fear that affected every aspect of my daily life. "It's a family tradition that goes back generations," my father explained when I asked him why Marcus had to go through such terrible experiences. "My grandfather did it to my father did it to me, and I'll do it to you and your brother when the time comes. It builds character and teaches boys how to handle adversity." "But it looked like torture," I said quietly. Marcus was really scared and hurt. "Sometimes the most important lessons are the hardest ones to learn," Dad replied. "Marcus will be stronger and tougher because of what he went through. He'll be able to handle whatever life throws at him because he's already proven he can survive worse." "What if I don't want to go through it?" "Then you wouldn't really be a Sullivan," Dad said, and the threat in his voice was unmistakable. "Every man in this family has earned his place through that tradition. Boys who aren't strong enough to handle it don't deserve to be part of what we've built here." The message was clear. Participation in the hazing wasn't optional, and failure to endure it would result in rejection from the family I depended on for love, identity, and belonging. Over the next 2 years, I watched other male cousins go through similar ordeals when they turned 12, and each ceremony reinforced my terror about what awaited me. My brother Jake was 2 years younger than me, which meant he'd face his initiation 2 years after mine. He was 10 years old and already anxious about the approaching ritual, having witnessed the same traumatic ceremonies that had shaped my own fears about our family's definition of masculinity. "I don't want to do it, Connor," Jake confided to me one evening as we sat in our shared bedroom, discussing the approaching date of my 12th birthday. "I'm scared of what they're going to do to us." "Me too," I admitted, though I felt responsible for protecting my younger brother from fears he shouldn't have to carry. "But maybe it won't be as bad as it looked. Maybe they just want to make sure we can handle tough situations." "Marcus still has nightmares about his initiation," Jake said quietly. "I heard him telling his mom that he wishes he wasn't a Sullivan anymore." The conversation revealed how deeply the hazing tradition was affecting all the children in our family, not just the boys who directly experienced it. We lived in constant fear of the approaching ordeals, developed anxiety about our own capacity to endure pain and humiliation, and began questioning whether being part of our family was worth the trauma that membership required. When my 12th birthday finally arrived in September 2021, I felt like I was walking toward my own execution. The family gathering was planned for the weekend after my birthday, giving me several days to contemplate what awaited me while trying to maintain normal routines at school and home. "You ready for this weekend, son?" Dad asked during the week leading up to the ceremony, his voice carrying expectations that felt like pressure on my chest. "I think so," I lied, though I felt anything but ready for whatever torture the adults had planned for me. "Remember, the point isn't to hurt you, it's to help you discover how strong you really are," Dad said, though his explanation didn't align with the obvious cruelty I'd witnessed during previous ceremonies. "Every Sullivan man has gone through this and come out stronger on the other side. What if I can't do it? What if I'm not strong enough?" "You are strong enough," Dad insisted, though his tone suggested that failure wasn't really an option. "You come from a long line of tough men, and that toughness is in your blood. You just have to find it and prove it to yourself and your family." The weekend of my initiation, I barely slept and could hardly eat, my stomach churning with anxiety about the unknown challenges that awaited me. Jake was especially quiet and clingy, perhaps understanding that my experience would preview his own future ordeal. "I'll be okay," I told him, though I didn't believe my own reassurances. "And I'll make sure you're okay too when it's your turn." The ceremony itself was every bit as traumatic as I'd feared, involving hours of physical challenges, psychological intimidation, and deliberate infliction of pain designed to push me beyond my limits. I was forced to endure cold water immersion, painful physical exercises, verbal abuse that attacked my character and masculinity, and dangerous activities that left me injured and exhausted. "Stop crying and take it like a man," Grandfather commanded when I finally broke down after being forced to hold burning embers until my hands were blistered. "Sullivan men don't whimper about a little pain." "I can't do it anymore," I sobbed, my hands shaking from the burns and my body exhausted from hours of abuse. "Please, I want to stop." "You stop when you've proven you're worthy of the Sullivan name," Uncle Ray replied, grabbing my arm roughly. "Right now, you're acting like a weak little boy who doesn't deserve to be part of this family." The hazing continued until I was delirious with exhaustion and pain, but eventually the adults declared that I'd passed the test and earned my place as a real Sullivan man. I felt no pride or accomplishment, only relief that the ordeal was over and traumatic memories that would affect me for years afterward. 2 years later, when Jake's 12th birthday approached, I hoped that my parents might have recognized the psychological damage the tradition caused and chosen to break the cycle of abuse. Instead, they began preparing for his initiation with the same grim determination they'd shown for mine. "Jake's ceremony is going to be special," Grandfather announced during a family dinner. "He's a sensitive boy, so we'll need to be especially thorough in teaching him what it means to be tough." The implication that Jake's sensitivity made him more in need of harsh treatment filled me with protective rage and desperate fear for my younger brother's well-being. Jake's initiation weekend in October 2023 began the same way mine had, with a family gathering at Grandfather's cabin and an atmosphere of ritualistic preparation that felt more like preparing for a sacrifice than celebrating a birthday. But this time, I was 14 and old enough to understand that what our family called tradition was actually systematic child abuse disguised as character building. "I'm scared, Connor," Jake whispered to me the night before his ceremony as we lay in the cabin's bunk room listening to the adult men discuss their plans for the next day. "What if I can't handle it? What if I embarrass the family?" You won't embarrass anyone, I assured him, though I was terrified about what the adults might do to my sensitive, gentle brother. And no matter what happens, I'll be there. I won't let them hurt you more than they have to. But I was just a 14-year-old boy myself, with no power to protect Jake from the adults who controlled our family dynamics and no authority to challenge traditions that had been established long before either of us was born. All I could do was witness his suffering and try to provide emotional support that felt pathetically inadequate. The ceremony itself was more brutal than my own had been, as if the adults were determined to toughen up Jake's perceived sensitivity through extra doses of cruelty and intimidation. They subjected him to physical challenges that were clearly beyond his capacity, psychological abuse that targeted his insecurities, and dangerous activities that left him injured and traumatized. Please stop, Jake begged after being forced to jump from increasingly high platforms until he was limping from a twisted ankle. I'll do anything else, but I can't jump anymore. My leg really hurts. Pain is just weakness leaving the body, Grandfather replied with the same cold detachment he'd shown during my own initiation. Real men push through pain instead of making excuses about being hurt. But I think it might be broken, Jake sobbed, trying to put weight on his injured leg and nearly falling from the effort. It's not broken, it's just sore, Uncle Ray dismissed his obvious distress. Stop being dramatic and get ready for the next challenge. But Jake's ankle was more than sore, it was seriously injured from the repeated impacts of jumping from heights that no 12-year-old should have been forced to attempt. When they made him continue the ceremony despite his obvious pain and difficulty walking, I realized that the adults were so committed to their tradition that they were willing to ignore genuine medical emergencies. Dad, Jake is really hurt, I said, approaching my father during a brief break in the activities. He needs to see a doctor, not continue with more challenges. Jake is fine, Dad replied without even looking at my brother, who was sitting on the ground holding his swollen ankle and trying not to cry. He's just not used to pushing through discomfort like the rest of us. It's not discomfort, it's an injury. Look at how swollen his ankle is. Connor, you're not helping your brother by babying him, Dad said firmly. He needs to learn to handle adversity without running to adults for rescue every time something gets difficult. The ceremony continued for another 2 hours, with Jake limping through increasingly dangerous and painful challenges while the adults ignored his obvious injury and escalating distress. By the time they finally declared him worthy of the Sullivan name, he was barely conscious from pain and exhaustion. You did good, son, Grandfather told Jake as he collapsed on the ground, his face gray with pain and his injured ankle swollen to twice its normal size. You proved you can handle whatever life throws at you. Thank you, Grandfather, Jake whispered, though he was clearly in too much pain to feel grateful for the abuse he'd endured. That night, Jake's ankle was so swollen and discolored that even the adults couldn't ignore the severity of his injury. Mom finally insisted on taking him to the emergency room, despite protests from Grandfather and the uncles that seeking medical attention was making a big deal out of nothing. He's been complaining about that ankle all day, Mom told the emergency room doctor, conveniently omitting the circumstances that had caused Jake's injury. We thought it was just a sprain, but it keeps getting worse. The X-rays revealed that Jake had fractured his ankle in multiple places, requiring surgery to repair the damage and weeks of recovery that would affect his mobility and athletic activities for months. The doctor was clearly suspicious about the circumstances surrounding such a severe injury in a 12-year-old boy. How exactly did this happen? Dr. Sarah Martinez asked, examining the X-rays that showed the extent of Jake's injuries. This type of fracture usually results from significant trauma or repeated impact injuries. He was jumping around at a family gathering, Dad explained vaguely. Boys will be boys, you know. He probably just landed wrong. The pattern of fractures suggests multiple impacts rather than a single fall, Dr. Martinez observed. Are you sure this was just normal play activity? Yes, we're sure, Mom said quickly, though I could see worry in her expression as she realized that Jake's injuries were more serious than anyone had acknowledged. Dr. Martinez continued asking questions about the circumstances of Jake's injury, and I could see my parents growing increasingly uncomfortable with the medical scrutiny of what had happened during the family tradition. When she mentioned the possibility of reporting suspected child abuse, the atmosphere in the emergency room became tense and defensive. This was an accident during normal family activities, Dad insisted. There's no abuse involved. My son was participating in activities with his cousins and got hurt the way kids sometimes do. Sir, I'm required to report injuries that appear inconsistent with the explanations provided, Dr. Martinez said firmly. The severity and pattern of your son's fractures raise concerns that need to be investigated. Over the next few days, our family was visited by Child Protective Services investigators who asked detailed questions about Jake's injury and the family gathering where it had occurred. The adults maintained their story about normal family activities and accidental injury during play, but the investigators seemed skeptical about the explanations they were given. "Can you tell me what happened when you got hurt?" the CPS worker, Mrs. Linda Park, asked Jake during a private interview. Jake looked terrified, caught between telling the truth about the hazing and protecting the family members who'd insisted that discussing the tradition with outsiders would be a betrayal of family loyalty. "I was jumping and I fell," he said quietly, sticking to the story the adults had coached him to tell. "It was an accident." "Jumping from where? Can you describe the activity you were doing when you got hurt?" "Just jumping. Like a game." "I landed wrong." Mrs. Park asked follow-up questions that made it clear she suspected there was more to the story than Jake was telling, but without his cooperation or additional evidence, she couldn't prove that the injury had resulted from deliberate abuse rather than accidental harm during family activities. "We'll be monitoring this family's situation," Mrs. Park told my parents before closing the investigation. "If there are any additional injuries or concerns, we'll need to revisit these questions about your family's activities and supervision of the children." The CPS investigation terrified my grandfather and the other adults involved in the hazing tradition, not because they recognized the harm they were causing but because they feared outside interference in what they considered private family matters. Instead of reconsidering the tradition itself, they focused on better concealing it from outside scrutiny. "We need to be more careful about injuries and medical attention," Grandfather told the assembled men during a family meeting after the investigation was closed. "These government busybodies don't understand family traditions, and they'll try to destroy what we've built here if we give them excuses to interfere." "Maybe we should stop doing the initiations," I suggested, surprising myself with my boldness in challenging Grandfather's authority. Jake could have been permanently disabled. "The tradition isn't worth seriously hurting people. The tradition is exactly worth protecting," Grandfather replied coldly. "What happened to Jake was unfortunate, but it doesn't change the fact that every Sullivan man needs to prove himself through adversity. We just need to be smarter about how we conduct the ceremonies." "Smarter about how we hurt children?" I asked, my anger overriding my fear of consequences. "Smarter about building men without attracting unwanted attention from people who don't understand what we're doing," Grandfather corrected. "The tradition continues, but we'll modify our methods to avoid injuries that require medical attention." The idea that the adults' main concern was avoiding detection rather than preventing harm revealed everything I needed to know about their true priorities. They weren't interested in our well-being. They were interested in perpetuating a cycle of abuse while avoiding accountability for the damage they caused. Jake's recovery took months, during which he struggled with not only the physical limitations of his injured ankle but also the psychological trauma of the hazing experience. He developed anxiety, had nightmares about the ceremony, and became withdrawn from family activities in ways that concerned even our parents. "I don't want to be a Sullivan anymore," Jake told me one evening while we were doing homework together. "If being part of this family means hurting people and getting hurt, I don't want to belong here." "I know how you feel," I replied, though I wasn't sure how to help him process trauma that our own family had inflicted on him. "But we can't really stop being Sullivans. We can just try to be different kinds of Sullivans than the men who came before us." "What do you mean?" "I mean we can choose not to continue the tradition when we're adults. We can choose not to hurt our own kids the way we were hurt." "But what if Grandfather and the uncles make us continue it?" "They can't make us do anything when we're adults with our own families," I said, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true. "We can break the cycle and teach our kids that being a man doesn't require surviving abuse." The conversation with Jake marked the beginning of my understanding that the hazing tradition wasn't an inevitable part of our family identity. It was a choice that each generation made about how to treat the next generation. I began to see my future role not as continuing the tradition but as ending it. 2 years later, when my youngest cousin Tyler approached his 12th birthday, I made the decision to speak up more forcefully about the family's hazing practices. I was 16 by then, old enough to understand the legal and moral implications of what the adults were planning, and determined to prevent another child from experiencing the trauma that had affected Jake and me. "Uncle Mike, I need to talk to you about Tyler's initiation," I said, approaching my uncle privately before the family gathering. "What happened to Jake was really serious, and I'm worried that Tyler could get hurt just as badly." "Tyler's initiation will be conducted more carefully than Jake's," Uncle Mike replied. "We've learned from that experience and adjusted our approach." "The problem isn't the approach, it's the whole concept," I said. Hurting children to make them men is child abuse, and it's not making any of us stronger or better people. Connor, you're too young to understand the importance of these traditions, Uncle Mike said dismissively. When you're older and have sons of your own, you'll appreciate what your grandfather and father did for you. I'll never put my children through what you put Jake and me through, I said firmly. And I won't stand by and watch you traumatize Tyler the way you traumatized us. Then maybe you shouldn't be part of Tyler's weekend, Uncle Mike suggested, though his tone carried a threat about my continued acceptance within the family. Maybe I shouldn't be part of a family that hurts children, I replied, realizing as I said it that I was choosing Tyler's safety over my own belonging and acceptance. My decision to speak out against Tyler's initiation created conflict within the family that ultimately led to my exclusion from future gatherings and a gradual estrangement from the relatives who prioritized tradition over child welfare. But it also prevented Tyler from experiencing the trauma that had affected every other boy in our family, and it marked the beginning of breaking a cycle of abuse that had continued for 4 generations. Today, both Jake and I are adults who've chosen to build our own definition of masculinity based on strength, integrity, and protection of vulnerable people rather than the infliction of trauma and the endurance of abuse. We've both received therapy to process the psychological damage caused by our family's hazing tradition, and we've both committed to ensuring that no children in our future families will ever be subjected to similar experiences. Being a man means protecting people who can't protect themselves, Jake told me recently during a conversation about our childhood experiences. It means using your strength to make others feel safe, not to prove how much pain you can inflict or endure. The Sullivan family tradition of hazing ended with our generation, not because we weren't tough enough to continue it but because we were strong enough to recognize that real strength doesn't require the systematic abuse of children. Some traditions deserve to be preserved, but others deserve to be abandoned in favor of more humane and constructive approaches to building character and teaching life skills. The men who came before us confused cruelty with strength, trauma with resilience, and abuse with love. We chose to define masculinity differently, and our children will benefit from that choice even if it cost us our place in a family that valued tradition more than the well-being of its most vulnerable members.